The arrival at Station Miravel. Round pushpin location. Deep Space Transit Hub, Station Miravel, Outer Galactic Rim year 2387. The announcement crackled through every speaker on Station Miravel's Level 9 processing bay, a sound like distant thunder being strangled by bureaucracy. Attention! All organic passengers arriving on Transit Corridor 7 Alpha are required to submit to full biometric clearance before advancing to residential sectors. Non-compliance will result in immediate detainment. Nobody moved particularly fast. They never did on Miravel. The station had the unique distinction of being the most heavily regulated transit hub in 4-star systems, and its security force, the Miravel Containment Unit or MCU, took enormous pride in this fact. 5 of its finest officers now stood in a tight formation near Gate 7A, their obsidian armor gleaming under the harsh processing lights, pulse batons humming at their hips. The first to step off the transit shuttle was a woman who looked entirely unremarkable at first glance. Her name was Sable Oren, and she was 34 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, with warm brown skin, close-cropped natural hair threaded with a few silver strands that she'd never bothered to hide, and eyes the exact color of strong tea held up to morning light. She wore a worn gray cargo jacket with too many pockets, all of them full, and carried a large duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a thermal flask in her right hand, which she was sipping from with the focused contentment of someone who had been waiting for this particular sip for approximately 6 hours. Behind her, the other passengers funneled out in nervous clusters. A Velhari diplomat in ceremonial wrappings. A group of Denosian traders with their bioluminescent gill frills pulled tight in anxiety. A family of Terrans from the Kepler colonies, children clutching stuffed animals. All of them gave the MCU officers a wide berth. Sable Oren did not give them a wide berth. She walked directly toward the checkpoint station, took another sip from her flask and offered the nearest guard, a tall, angular man with a jaw like a shelf and a nameplate reading Ethovec RL, a perfectly pleasant smile. "Good afternoon," she said. Sergeant Rail did not smile back. He was constitutionally opposed to smiling on duty. He held out one gauntlet hand. Identification. Purpose of visit. Duration of stay. Declaration of any hazardous materials, biological specimens, or unauthorized xenotech. Absolutely. Sable set her flask down on the counter, reached into one of her 17 pockets, the third one from the left on the inside flap, and produced a small data chip. She handed it over. "I'm here for the Xenobiology Research Symposium in Sector 4. Duration is 12 days. And no hazardous materials." "Well." She paused, glancing at her flask. "Depends who you ask about the coffee. My old supervisor used to say it was a health hazard." Rail did not respond to this. He inserted the chip into the reader and waited. What came back made him go very still. The name Sable Oren was attached to 14 separate research credentials. 3 doctorates, Xenobiology, Adaptive Systems Engineering, and something called Interspecies Cognitive Harmonics, which didn't even have a standardized definition in the MCU database. She had clearance codes from the Galactic Science Consortium, the Terran Diplomatic Corps, the Independent Researchers Guild, and, he scrolled down, slightly confused, the Miravel station itself, granted 6 years prior as part of a consulting agreement. The file was 47 pages long. "One moment," Rail said and turned to his team. The 5 guards huddled. There was murmuring. One of them, Officer Dren Vaska, new to the posting and still impressionable, kept looking back at Sable with poorly concealed suspicion. Another, Officer Helena Brack, who had been on the station for 11 years and had seen everything, was reading the credentials with an expression that suggested she had started to develop a headache. Sable waited. She retrieved her flask. She sipped. "Dr. Oren," Rail said finally returning, "your credentials are valid. However, standard protocol for individuals with level 5 or above clearance requires an escort through the processing bay." "Of course," she agreed immediately. This seemed to confuse him slightly. He had been prepared for resistance. "You'll need to submit your bag to secondary inspection as well." Naturally. More confusion. "And the flask?" "Oh." She looked down at it. "I'd rather keep that if it's all right. It's climate locked, tampering would seal it permanently and then none of us could open it, which would be a shame because I have a full thermos of Cathali Mountain Blend in here and I was going to offer everyone a cup once we'd sorted out the paperwork." She looked at the 5 guards with genuine, uncomplicated friendliness. "You all look like you've had a long shift." Sergeant Thovek Rail had worked security for 19 years. He had processed smugglers, black market xenotech traders, 3 separate individuals who turned out to be on intergalactic most wanted lists, and one memorable incident involving a Garathi merchant and 40 live specimens of an insect species that was only mildly illegal to transport but deeply unpleasant to contain. He had never been offered coffee. He looked at the flask. He looked at his team. Officer Vasca was still suspicious. Officer Brack had stopped pretending to read and was now openly watching this exchange with something approaching interest. The other three, Koro, Maeve and old Sergeant Thess, who was 6 months from retirement, were maintaining professional neutrality with varying degrees of success. The flask can be assessed on site, Rail said finally, with the air of someone making a decision he didn't entirely understand. This way, Dr. Oren. Sable Oren picked up her duffel bag, tucked her flask under her arm, and followed them into Station Miravel, surrounded by 5 armed guards, smiling like someone who had just arrived exactly where she intended to be. Which she had. She always did. The inspection room, and what was in the bag. Round pushpin location. MCU Secondary Processing Suite, Level 9, Station Miravel. The inspection room was deliberately unpleasant. This was intentional design, a feature, not a bug. The walls were the color of old concrete, the lighting was fluorescent and slightly too blue, and the single table in the center had been bolted to the floor, presumably because someone had once tried to throw it. Sable set her duffel bag on the table, unzipped it fully, and stepped back with her hands relaxed at her sides. "I'll save us both some time and tell you what's in there," she offered. Officer Dren Vasca, young, intense, still very much in the phase of his career where he believed that suspicious-looking people were suspicious for good reasons, pulled on inspection gloves and moved toward the bag. "That won't be necessary." "It absolutely will," said Sable pleasantly, "because the compartment on the left side has a biometric lock and you'll need my thumbprint to open it, and the one on the right has live specimens." Vasca stopped. Live specimens. Dormant. Temperature-controlled. Completely safe. She paused. Probably. The dormancy field is rated for 14-day transit. We're at day 6. So statistically, we have excellent margins. She tilted her head. "Would you like me to walk you through the containment specs?" Sergeant Rail, standing near the door with his arms folded, watched this exchange with the particular stillness of a man who was recalibrating his threat assessment model in real time. He had expected, based on the credentials, the confidence, the inexplicable flask, that Dr. Oren was either a high-level official who would be insufferably imperious about her status, or a sophisticated operator of some kind who would become evasive when pressed. She was neither. She was, as far as he could tell, simply very comfortable. Officer Helena Brack, who had 11 years of experience and a finely tuned instinct for the difference between dangerous and merely unusual, came to stand beside Vasca and look into the bag. It was genuinely full. There were 3 compressed fabric sample cases. 2 data tablets, one clearly personal, cracked screen, covered in adhesive notes, and one institutional. A small portable laboratory unit, folded flat and secured with magnetic clasps. A sealed nutrition kit. A secondary flask, smaller, unlabeled. For books, actual printed books, which was an eccentricity so profound in this era that Brack simply stared at them for a moment. A folded piece of paper, actual paper, with handwritten notes on it. A small carved figurine, Terran craft by the look of it, worn smooth by handling. And, nestled among all of this, a compact and entirely unremarkable thermal case with the logo of the Galactic Science Consortium stamped on the side. The thermal case was humming very faintly. "That's the specimens," Sable said, nodding toward it. 12 dormant Sethali crystalline larvae. They're subjects in a study on adaptive mineral integration in non-carbon primary life forms. Completely passive at this temperature. The case is sealed and the seal log will show it hasn't been opened since I packed them on Vethra Station. She paused. "Don't tap the case, please. Not because it's dangerous but because they don't like it." "They're dormant," Vasca said. "Yes. Dormant organisms don't have preferences." Sable considered this. "That's actually one of the things the study is examining," she said, with the gentle enthusiasm of someone who genuinely found this interesting. "The working hypothesis is that their crystalline structure allows a form of environmental sensitivity even during dormancy. Tapping the case produces microvibrations that show up in their molecular lattice patterns post-revival. Whether that constitutes not liking it in any meaningful sense is," she smiled, "the question." There was a pause. Officer Brack, to her own evident surprise, said, "How do you measure that?" "Spectral lattice imaging. I can show you the methodology papers if you're interested. I have them on the institutional tablet." Sable was already reaching for it, not with the defensive energy of someone trying to prove innocence, but with the animated motion of someone who had been hoping someone would ask. The really remarkable thing is that the patterns aren't random, there's a consistency across subjects that suggests. That's not necessary, Vasca said firmly, because he could feel the room drifting in a direction that he didn't feel was appropriate for a security inspection. We need to verify the containment unit's seal integrity. Standard protocol. Of course. Sable stepped back further, giving them full access. The seal verification code is KEF 7-7 Orin Delta. That should pull up the full chain of custody. It did. Every transfer point, every temperature log, every inspection stamp, all the way back to the original packing on Vethra 42 standard hours ago. It was, objectively, one of the most well-documented sets of specimens Rail had ever seen come through his processing bay. He looked at Brack. She gave a small shrug that said, "I've got nothing." Vasca looked at the biometric compartment. The locked section. Personal research notes, primarily. Some correspondence. Nothing classified above level 4. She pressed her thumb to the lock. It opened. Inside, a dense stack of handwritten note cards, a pressed flower in a small frame, Terran rose very old, and a half-eaten protein bar. "For emergencies," Sable said, nodding at the protein bar. "I get very focused and forget to eat." Sergeant Thovek Rail, 19 years of service, had a decision to make. Every document was in order. Every specimen was accounted for. The bag contained nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, nothing even particularly suspicious. And yet, "I'd like to ask you some questions," he said. "Standard security interview. It won't take long." "Absolutely." Sable settled into the inspection room's single chair with the ease of someone sitting down to a pleasant conversation. "And genuinely, while we talk, can I offer everyone coffee? The Cathali blend is best hot, and I've been told it helps with long shift fatigue." She was already unscrewing the flask. "It's not a bribe. I just have too much and the thermal lock keeps it at exactly 87 degrees indefinitely, which is a gift and a curse." Sergeant Rail found himself, against all protocol and prior experience, accepting a cup. He would later tell himself this was a tactical decision. Accepting helped establish rapport, which aided interrogation. This was a complete rationalization, and he knew it because the real reason was that the coffee smelled extraordinary and he was 4 hours into a 12-hour shift. The coffee was, in fact, exceptional. He began his questions. Sable answered all of them, completely, calmly, and with occasional digressions into genuinely fascinating scientific tangents that Rail had to actively redirect, because he was a professional, and also because if he didn't redirect them he would keep listening. In the corner, Officer Vasca did not accept coffee. He was holding the line. But he was weakening. The history they didn't know they were asking about. Round pushpin location, Level 9 Administrative Corridor and Archive Access Point, Station Miravel. The security interview had been running for 40 minutes, significantly longer than standard protocol required, when Officer Koro, the quietest of the 5 guards, said something unexpected. "Orin." He looked up from the data terminal where he'd been cross-referencing credentials. "Is that a Kelthani name?" Sable's expression shifted slightly. Not with defensiveness or surprise, more the way a person's face shifts when they encounter something they weren't expecting to encounter in a particular place. "My grandmother was Kelthani, yes. My surname is hers. My mother's people are from the Kelthani orbital settlements," Koro said. He was a compact man, dark-skinned, with an understated quality that Sable had noticed from the start, the kind of person who observes more than they reveal. "Orin is an old name. Scholar caste." "It is," she agreed. She was a linguist. Spent 40 years working on dead languages, mostly Vethran pre-contact dialects. A beat. "That's actually how I ended up in xenobiology." She used to say that the most important thing about understanding another species was not their biology, it was what they found worth saying. There was a pause that was slightly different in quality from the previous pauses in the room. Sergeant Rail, who had been listening to everything while maintaining the appearance of reviewing documents, set down his cup. "The Vethran pre-contact dialects. That's the language group that was considered extinct until the Deep Archive expedition of 2371, yes." Sable nodded. "My grandmother didn't live to see it confirmed, but her work was part of the foundational research. The crystalline specimens I'm carrying, the Sethali larvae, they communicate using mineral resonance frequencies that overlap with certain pre-contact Vethran phonemic structures. That's the link that brought me to this field." She paused. "I know that sounds improbable. It sounds like a research abstract I'd actually read, said Officer Brack, who had been standing by the door and was now, she realized, not particularly guarding it in any meaningful sense. Vasca made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a protest but occupied the space between them. We're getting off track. We were off track about 8 minutes in, Brack told him, not unkindly. We're just further off now. It was Sergeant Thess, old Thess, 6 months from retirement, who had said precisely nothing for the last 40 minutes and who everyone had more or less forgotten was in the room, who spoke next. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms folded and his eyes half closed, which was either alertness or near sleep, depending on how well you knew him. I remember the archive expedition announcement, Thess said. He had a voice like gravel in a slow current. 2371. I was stationed on Vethel Secondary at the time. There was an incident. During the excavation. Everyone looked at him. A collapse, he continued. In the primary dig site. 3 researchers trapped. I was part of the retrieval team. He looked at Sable. One of the researchers wouldn't leave until she'd secured the language archive. Held up the whole operation for 2 hours while we tried to convince her the structure was going to come down. Pause. She was right as it turned out. The structure held another 6 hours. The archive was the only complete record that survived the site. Sable was very still. The researcher's name was Oren, Thess said. I remember it because it was unusual. And because she argued with our lead retrieval officer for 45 minutes using the most technically correct and utterly unreasonable logic I have ever heard, and he eventually gave up. That was my mother, Sable said quietly. The room absorbed this. Thess nodded slowly. She was, he considered the word, formidable. She was, Sable agreed. She died 4 years ago. Off-world survey accident. The Sethali research, partly this trip, it's building on a paper she never finished. There was the kind of silence that happens when something unexpectedly real enters a space designed to be purely procedural. Vasca, to his credit, recovered first. He was young and still believed in the sharp lines of protocol, but he was not incapable of being human inside those lines. He looked back at his data terminal, cleared his throat and said in a somewhat softer register than he'd been using, all credentials have been verified. No contraband. No unauthorized materials. Pause. The dormancy unit is fully compliant. Thank you, Sable said. Rail picked up his cup, it was nearly empty now, and thought about the fact that he had expected this stop to take 10 minutes, and it had taken nearly an hour, and somehow during that hour he had learned about pre-contact linguistics and crystalline larval biology and the 2371 expedition, and he had found out that Thess, who had worked alongside him for 7 years, had once helped rescue a researcher whose daughter was now sitting in his inspection room. There's one more thing, he said. Sable waited. Your consulting agreement with Station Miravel, 6 years ago. What was it for? Sable smiled. The ventilation system on level 12 kept failing. It was a resonance problem. The frequency of the atmospheric processors was interfering with a structural vibration node in the outer hull. Nothing catastrophic but chronic. Facilities management had been trying to fix it for 2 years. She shrugged. I was in transit, I heard about it, I looked at the specs and worked out the adjustment. Took about 4 hours. The station administrator was very grateful. Rail stared at her for a long moment. You fixed our ventilation system. I like fixing things, Sable said simply. And I had time. He looked at Brack. Brack looked at Thess. Thess looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound philosophical acceptance. Vasca finally accepted the last cup of coffee. He held it with both hands and stared into it as though looking for something. The symposium starts tomorrow, he said eventually. Level 4 East Wing. In case you didn't know the route. I did know, Sable said. But thank you. The incident on Level 7. Round pushpin location. Station Miravel, commercial transit level, Level 7, 16 hours later. Station Miravel had a problem. This was not an unusual state for Station Miravel to be in, but this particular problem was more urgent than most. At 0340 station time, the deep quiet hours when only maintenance crews and insomniacs occupied the corridors, a pressure seal on Level 7's commercial transit ring had experienced a microfracture. The fracture itself was minor. What made it a problem was that Level 7 sat directly above the thermal regulation conduits for the station's primary life support array, and the pressure differential being created by the fracture was, slowly, persistently, with the quiet inevitability of physics, feeding warm gas into a sensor cluster that was not designed to receive it. The sensor cluster was not failing. It was, however, beginning to report incorrect atmospheric readings to the automated response system. And the automated response system, following its programming with perfect and catastrophic obedience, was preparing to initiate a pressure correction cycle that would, in approximately 90 minutes, create a cascading thermal event in the life support conduits. The kind that would require full evacuation of 6 levels. The engineering crew had been alerted. They were coming. They would almost certainly be able to address it. Almost certainly in approximately 2 hours. They had 90 minutes. Sergeant Rail, who had drawn the overnight command shift, was standing in the corridor near the fracture site holding a situation report and experiencing the specific flavor of stress that comes from a problem which is simultaneously urgent, technical, and outside one's direct control when he heard footsteps. Sable Oren rounded the corner carrying her flask and wearing the slightly dazed expression of someone who had woken up very early for reasons she hadn't fully made peace with yet. "What's happening?" she said, reading the energy of the corridor, the station guards, the quarantine tape, the data readers tracking the pressure differential in real time, with an efficiency that suggested she was more awake than she appeared. "Pressure seal fracture," Rail said, which was more than he technically needed to say to a civilian, but at this particular moment he was beyond being precisely technical about information sharing. "It's feeding incorrect data to the automated life support response system. Engineering is en route but..." Timeline? 90 minutes if the cascade initiates. Engineering arrival? Best estimate 2 hours. Sable was already looking at the quarantine tape, at the sensor cluster readings on the nearest data board, at the pressure differential graph that was climbing in slow, patient increments. She was not looking at it with alarm. She was looking at it the way she looked at everything, steadily, with focused assessment like a person running calculations. "Is the fracture accessible?" she asked. "Civilian access to the breach site is prohibited," said Officer Vasca, who was on the overnight shift and had therefore been here when Sable arrived. He was stationed near the tape with the resolute energy of someone who intended to maintain protocol while the station potentially cascaded into crisis. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to return to your quarters." "I understand," Sable said. "Can I ask a clarifying question first? The situation is being managed. Is it being managed within the available timeline?" Pause. "Engineering is en route," Vasca repeated, slightly less firmly. Sable looked at Rail. Rail looked at the pressure differential graph, which had ticked up 2 more points in the time they'd been standing here. "What would you need?" Rail asked. Vasca made a sound. "Access to the sensor cluster," Sable said immediately. "Not the fracture itself. I can't fix a structural breach without equipment. But the sensor cluster is reporting bad data to the response system, and if I can interrupt that reporting chain manually, the response system won't have grounds to initiate the cascade. It buys time." She paused. "I'd also need a resonance tuner. There should be one in any maintenance kit on this level, and my portable lab unit from my bag. The resonance frequency of the fracture is affecting the sensor array in a way that's very similar to a problem I've seen before. Specifically about 6 years ago. On level 12. Rail stared at her. "The ventilation system," he said. "Resonance interference," she confirmed. "Different source, same principle. I believe I can introduce a counter frequency through the lab unit that will neutralize the sensor corruption until engineering arrives." "That's," Vasca started. "Theoretically sound," said Officer Brack, who had also drawn overnight and was reviewing the technical specs on her data reader with an expression of reluctant agreement. "The sensor array works on frequency-sensitive photon detection. If the corrupting frequency can be isolated and countered." "How certain are you?" Rail asked Sable. She thought about this for a moment with the honest deliberation of someone who understood the weight of the question. 78%, she said. Which sounds low. But the cascade is a certainty without intervention, and engineering arrival is a probability with an unfavorable timeline. 78 is better than those odds. And if you're wrong? Then we're exactly where we are now, minus about 20 minutes. She met his eyes. "I'm not going to pretend I can't be wrong. I am occasionally. But I know this problem." Rail looked at Vasca. Vasca was standing very straight with the posture of someone fighting the urge to adapt to circumstances. He looked at Brack. She gave the small shrug, "Same as yesterday." That meant, "I've run the math and I don't like the alternative." "Get her portable unit," Rail said. "And find a maintenance kit." Vasca exhaled. But he moved. What followed was 43 minutes of focused, quiet, precise work. Sable on her knees beside the sensor cluster with her portable lab unit humming beside her and a resonance tuner in her hand, talking through what she was doing in a low ongoing commentary that was partly for her own focus and partly, Rail noticed, because it meant everyone in the corridor could follow her reasoning in real time, which was a kind of trust she was extending without being asked to. Brack crouched beside her at one point and handed her a calibration tool she'd asked for without looking up. Vasca stood back. But he was watching. And about 20 minutes in he asked a question, a genuine one about the counterfrequency mathematics, and Sable answered it completely without condescension or impatience. At 0419 station time, the pressure differential graph stopped climbing. At 0423, the automated response system's cascade countdown reset to default. No triggering data. Engineering arrived at 0441. They fixed the fracture in 35 minutes. The lead engineer reviewed Sable's sensor correction, said, then actually this is quite elegant, and documented it in the repair log. In the corridor afterward, Rail said, "Thank you. You made the call," Sable said. "I just provided information. You provided the solution." She considered this. "Solutions are collaborative," she said. "You had the authority and you used it well under pressure. That matters." She picked up her flask, which had been sitting on the floor beside her for 43 minutes, maintaining its exact 87-degree temperature with admirable constancy. "Is it too early to offer coffee, or is this exactly the moment for it?" Vasca, without saying anything, held out his cup. What they remembered after she left. Round pushpin location. Station Miravel, departure gate 7A and Miravel command archived 12 days later. The Xenobiology Research Symposium lasted 12 days as scheduled. Sable Oren attended every session, presented her research on Cephali crystalline larval communication on day 7, answered questions for 90 minutes after her allotted 45, and received a standing ovation from an audience of 200 scientists that included 3 of the most distinguished xenobiologists in the Galactic Consortium, all of whom had initially scheduled brief courtesy visits to her session and remained for the duration. None of this was particularly surprising to anyone who had spent time with her. On day 9, a junior Denotion researcher named Kev Thallo experienced what could charitably be called a professional crisis when his entire dataset for a multi-year study turned out to contain a systematic calibration error that would invalidate his primary findings. He sat in the symposium corridor for 3 hours, staring at the wall, while his career as he had understood it reorganized itself into rubble around him. Sable found him there at approximately the same time she found most things, because she was passing by, paying attention, and chose to stop. She sat beside him. She didn't immediately say anything, which was its own kind of gift. When he told her what had happened, she looked at his data. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The calibration error is real. But look at what your corrected dataset actually shows." He looked. "That's not the study you planned to do," she said. "But it might be more interesting." It was. It took him 3 more weeks to see it clearly, but it was. He would publish under a different title than he'd expected, reach different conclusions than he'd planned, and the paper would be cited 47 times in the following 2 years. In his acknowledgments he would write, "To Dr. Oren, who looked at the same data I was looking at and saw something worth keeping." On day 11, Sable ran a workshop on interspecies cognitive harmonics that was not strictly part of the symposium program but was added when 6 attendees asked for it. 17 people showed up. They stayed for 4 hours. The station's head of educational programming, who sat in on the last 90 minutes, immediately filed a request to have the session content archived in the station's research library. On day 12, Sable packed her bag, methodically, all 17 pockets in specific order, the thermal specimen case checked and rechecked, the Cephali larvae dormant and presumably unbothered by transport vibrations, the pressed flower in its small frame tucked safely in the biometric compartment beside a new stack of note cards, and made her way back to gate 7A. The 5 guards were there. All 5 of them. This was not, strictly, procedurally required for the departure of a single passenger. Departure processing only required 1 officer. But Sergeant Thovek Rail was there, and Officer Helena Brack, and Officer Dren Vasca, and Officer Koro, and Old Sergeant Thess, 6 months from retirement, who had arranged his schedule to be present at Gate 7A at this particular time without explaining his reasons to anyone. Sable came through the corridor and stopped when she saw them. She looked at all 5 faces, at Rail's controlled steadiness, at Brack's wry attention, at Vasca's new and still slightly uncertain openness, at Koro's quiet depth, at Thessa's ancient and tranquil patience. "I expected 1 officer," she said. "Standard protocol," Rail said, which was not true. "Departure processing." "Of course," she agreed, because she understood what was actually happening, and she let it be what it was without making it strange. The processing took 8 minutes. Everything was in order. It had been in order to begin with. There had never been any real question of that. Koro had her departure chip ready before she reached the counter. Brack had already cleared her transport manifest. Vasca, who had spent 12 days thinking about the counter-frequency mathematics and had 3 follow-up questions that he'd written down on an actual piece of paper, handed her the paper as she collected her receipt. "If you have time," he said. She took the paper. "I'll answer in writing. Give me your contact." He had it ready. Tess, who had not spoken since she arrived, stepped forward when the others stepped back. He reached into his uniform pocket and produced something small, a transit coin, old station currency from Vethel Secondary, the kind that hadn't been in circulation for 15 years. He held it out. "My mother gave me that when I took this posting," he said. "Said it was from the settlement where she grew up. I've been meaning to give it to someone going somewhere useful." He looked at the thermal specimen case. It seemed relevant. Sable took it. She looked at it for a moment, worn smooth, the original stamp almost gone. She looked at Tess. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. She walked to the gate. At the threshold she paused. "One last thing," she said, turning back. They waited. "The Cephali larvae, when I revive them at the research station on Vethra, I'll be running the first test of the resonance communication hypothesis. The preliminary results will be published in the Galactic Xenobiology Quarterly in about 8 months." She looked at all 5 of them. "You were part of what made this trip work. I thought you should know that it goes somewhere." A small smile. "I'll include an acknowledgement if you'll give me your names. All 5 of you." There was a silence. "We're not researchers," Vasca said. "No," Sable agreed. "But you made a series of decisions under uncertainty that protected both proper security procedure and scientific progress, and you did it by thinking, not just by following scripts. That's worth acknowledging." She paused. "Besides, it will absolutely confuse the peer reviewers, and I find that entertaining." Rail, for the first time in 19 years of service, laughed at a checkpoint. They gave her their names. 8 months later, in the Galactic Xenobiology Quarterly, Volume 44, Issue 7, the paper titled Resonance-Mediated Communication in Cephali Crystalline Larvae, preliminary evidence for predormancy sensitivity retention included, on its final page, the following. Asterisk acknowledgements. The author extends particular thanks to the Miravel Containment Unit officers, Sergeant T. Rail, Officer H. Brack, Officer D. Vasca, Officer Koro Yen, and Sergeant E. Tess, whose combination of procedural rigor and genuine intellectual engagement made both the transit and the thinking cleaner. Research is never done in isolation, even when the containers are climate-locked and the corridors are long. Asterisk. Also, the Cathali Mountain Blend helped. Sergeant Tess received his copy of the journal 2 weeks before his retirement date. He read the acknowledgement 3 times. He didn't say anything about it to anyone, but he framed it, and he took it with him when he left.